Yeah, well, we had the idea of a brief summary of the whole project, but you see, it's just difficult. I mean, during the last 2.5 years, we've done so much, and even in the last 2 days, we've really dived into all the technical details of those several aspects of hydrogen underground storage. And I know it's Friday afternoon now, and therefore we want to be kind to you. We will not continue with technical details anymore, but we will have one step back. We will focus on a, let's say, a high-level discussion on how the hydrogen market, the hydrogen infrastructure, and especially also hydrogen storage may develop in the future. We have fantastic panelists for this discussion, and maybe open the slides. Where is it? Here. So give me one moment. It's over here. So yeah. So we have 4 fantastic panelists, and I think each of them has brought one presentation, and maybe it's best if I really if we start with the presentations first, and then I'll invite you afterwards to sit down here, and then we'll have a panel discussion together. Yeah, I've prepared a long introduction for this talk today, but I think it's not necessary anymore. I know you said mostly everything I also wanted to say. And now let me find the introduction for our first panelist. That's, I mean, the most important thing now. So it's Amalia Pizarro from the International Energy Agency. She's Energy Innovation Officer working at the Hydrogen and Alternative Fuel Unit. You're a principal author of the annual IEA's Global Hydrogen Review and Energy Technology Perspective. And she leads the work on hydrogen infrastructure there. And in this role, she will give us an overview on how the International Energy Agency sees the development in the global hydrogen market. And yeah, it's a pleasure having you here, and we are really excited on the additional aspects you can bring into the discussion. Thank you so much.
So while the presentation starts, so I'm very happy to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't attend and listen before, but I really look forward to have like the slides and to be able to integrate some of the perspectives of this workshop of these days in the upcoming publications of the IEA. And just to say that the insights I'm going to present now can be found in the IEA published annually the Global Hydrogen Review, which includes a chapter on hydrogen infrastructure, where we try to keep track of the hydrogen infrastructure projects and policies that are taking place all around the world, not only in Europe. Additionally, I will present some insights about the role of hydrogen storage in a net zero emissions scenario. This scenario is published in the World Energy Outlook that for the last 2 years is a publication that is for free. It was not back in the times, but now it's for free. So I really invite to all of you to check some of the insights I will present. And also on January 2023, we present the Energy Technology Perspectives 2023. And it has a full chapter dedicated to infrastructure. And within infrastructure, we cover in detail hydrogen infrastructure needs towards 2050 in a net zero emissions scenario. So just to say, the insights I will present today are about the scenario of the IEA of net zero emissions by 2050, but this is just one scenario. It is not the scenario, so this is just one possible way to comply with these net zero emissions by 2050 targets, but there will be a lot of other possible ways. This is not a forecast, this is not a prognosis, this is just an image on how the future might unfold. And this scenario also considers that we are within the 1.5 degrees limits. That is, that we comply with a carbon budget to make sure that not only we achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, but that we stay within 1.5 degrees limits. And first, in order to find out or to understand how much hydrogen storage we will need, we need to know how much hydrogen the world could consume in a net zero emissions scenario. Today's hydrogen consumption is 94 million tons of hydrogen. This is equivalent approximately to 8% the consumption of natural gas. But in a net zero emissions scenario, what we will see is, yes, in the next 7 years, just by 2030, hydrogen consumption will actually double. But we need to depart from the fact that today, only 1% of this hydrogen consumption is what we call low emission hydrogen. This is that it doesn't emit CO2 while it's being produced. So just in 7 years, it will double. By 2045, in this NCS scenario, hydrogen consumption in energy terms will be equivalent or will surpass natural gas consumption in that year. And by 2050, hydrogen consumption in energy terms will be higher than natural gas consumption. But even so, hydrogen consumption will be approximately 40% of today's natural gas consumption. This is in energy terms. It plays a smaller role, but it plays a critical role in order to decarbonize those hard-to-abate sectors, those sectors that cannot be easily electrified. And that's IEA's assumption for the net zero emissions scenario about hydrogen consumption. But one very important consideration regarding infrastructure is that today's hydrogen consumption is mostly linked to hydrogen that is produced and consumed in refineries or in ammonia plants. So only 7% of the hydrogen is merchant hydrogen production. That is, only 7% is kind of traded and potentially transported. By 2050, in this NCS scenario, we have that around 75% of the hydrogen that is produced is merchant hydrogen production. That is hydrogen that could be potentially transported and stored in large quantities. And as other presenters also talk about, we will also see interregional hydrogen trade because there will be obvious regions which could produce hydrogen at a much more lower cost. So hydrogen could be shipping over long distance, and that will also create hydrogen storage needs, not only to make sure that to provide certain degree of flexibility, but also to make sure that we have security if there are any disruptions to the supply chains. So these are the main assumptions behind our estimates about how much hydrogen infrastructure we will need. Just to say, this is a high-level estimations that we start this work last year. We don't have the temporal and spatial detail that probably some of you have for some of your studies, but we do want to call for attention about something that is important and to say this to policymakers that they should keep an eye on hydrogen infrastructure needs. So what does it mean in terms of investments? Today's global annual investments in natural gas infrastructure is approximately $150 billion. And what we see is like actually just in the next 7 years, just by the end of this decade, hydrogen infrastructure, pipelines, storage, hydrogen refueling stations, we estimate that investment needs in a net zero emissions scenario could be around $50 billion. This is around 1/3 of today's investment in natural gas infrastructure. We should also consider that infrastructure development takes time. So we need to start investing before we see these investments and before we need these investments. So that's also why we see significant high levels of hydrogen infrastructure investments already by the end of this decade. We also see that in a net zero emissions scenario, investments in natural gas related infrastructure will start decreasing because the world will start consuming less natural gas in order to comply with the carbon targets. So actually, by 2030, the combined investments in natural gas and hydrogen infrastructure will be equivalent to today's investment in natural gas infrastructure. So we are talking about kind of the same level of investments in gas infrastructure within the next years, decade. And towards 2050, hydrogen infrastructure related investments will increase because, of course, we will consume more hydrogen in order to decarbonize those hard-to-abate sectors. And there will be around annually around $80 billion US. This is lower than today's level of natural gas investments. It's lower because, as we mentioned before, hydrogen consumption in energy terms is smaller in this scenario than natural gas. It's not so small because hydrogen is much more complex than natural gas, especially because it takes a lot of volume, it liquefies at a very low temperature. So things are a bit more expensive, but because this NCE assumes lower energy demand of hydrogen, investments are a bit lower. So we require major investments in hydrogen infrastructure, and the most relevant thing is like we also require them in the very short term in order to make sure we have the technologies ready when we will need them. And we have been keeping track of the announcements made for hydrogen-related infrastructure projects. We have also tried to estimate how much, for example, how much hydrogen pipelines we will need. Today's natural gas pipelines are transmission pipelines is more than 1 million kilometers pipeline, around 1.2. We do estimate a lower amount of the length of hydrogen-related pipelines, and we also highlight the relevance that some of these pipelines could be repurposed pipelines, especially for onshore pipelines. There is already quite a lot of work being done. For offshore pipelines, this work has been initiated, and it seems it is also possible. And what we have seen is that actually the number of announced projects about new or repurposed pipelines aligns quite well with the needs of the NC scenario. Here in announced projects, we are also considering projects that do not have, well, they don't have a final investment decision, but they are considered here. So still, these are kind of wishful thinkings. We should move from action to actual implementation, final investment decisions, construction. But it seems is aligned. However, we can't say the same for underground gas storage projects. I know that by 2030, the dot seems like close to zero. It's not, but it's just a visual representation. But we have tried to estimate what could be in this net zero emissions scenario hydrogen underground storage needs. It is still quite complex because we have two main issues. One issue that from a systems analysis perspective is not so complex is flexibility. We could make some estimation of how much hydrogen storage we need for flexibility purpose. But we have another critical issue that is becoming more and more popular in the last year, that is security. And it's very difficult to quantify how much hydrogen underground storage we will need for security concerns. Nevertheless, we have acknowledged in these estimations that natural gas is a much more seasonal fuel. We don't expect that for hydrogen. We expect that there will be need of more storage, but that can be used more cyclical in order to provide flexibility, for example, when hydrogen is produced from variable renewable energy resources. So at the end, we have estimated a slightly lower amount of hydrogen storage compared to natural gas on a consumption basis. But we have found very little announced projects, and those that are announced or that appear in the map very often do not have a capacity associated. Do not have a year associated on when it could start an implementation. It seems it's a wishful thinking. It's an ambition, but it's very difficult for us to actually represent it in a model because there is no tangible outcome. And also, we want to highlight why it is important that we start developing these projects, and it's because in our scenario, we approximately estimate that we will need 420 BCMs of hydrogen storage. This is at normal conditions. But when we look at how long it took to develop the capacity of natural gas underground storage, it took 50, 60 years in order to have the same amount of storage in volumetric terms at normal conditions. And this is because hydrogen occupies a larger volume. We actually see in this NCS scenario that in a volumetric term, we will need the same amount of hydrogen storage than we have today of natural gas. And this is the same than developing in the next 30 years, double the capacity that we have developed in the last 30 years for natural gas. So we like to call for attention, because this is something that we really, it seems that we are lagging behind. And also some of my other colleagues in the Energy Technology Policy Division that are working with CCS highlight that we will also need porous reservoirs for CO2 storage. It seems this is a bit of less of a popular issue, but actually IEA's net zero emissions scenario considers less carbon capture and storage than, for example, IPCC scenarios. So even if we are not relying specifically a lot on carbon capture storage in order to fulfill the carbon targets, what we see, this comparison is at normal conditions. Of course, they have different behaviors, but actually, because once CO2 is stored, it can no longer be used as storage. We see that we will need 100 times more CO2 storage by 2050 in cumulative terms than for hydrogen. So there is the need to also consider how to best use these porous reservoirs. And why we want to stress that we need to start doing it now and that we cannot wait for too much is because, as you all know, gas infrastructure projects really take a long time to be developed. Here we have illustrated how was the average time it takes for planning and permitting and how much it takes for construction. Excepting for storage, for a lot of gas infrastructure projects, construction is quite an efficient, relatively fast process. It takes time, but it's relatively fast. Planning and permitting can really take a long time. So in the energy technology perspective report in general, the IEA calls for a need to make much more efficient and to reduce the times for planning and permitting. There are some particularly things that gas infrastructure face a lot, like socio-political opposition. So there is the need to start engaging and to find ways to really make the society and the politicians to support this type of transition. For the case of underground gas storage, construction also takes time. It's not so easy to really reduce this time. So we actually also call for the need for planning in advance, because inevitably these projects will take long amount of time. Then we also call for the need to investigate more in repurposing existing facilities that could really reduce these lead times, and especially could help us in some of the issues with planning, permitting, and social opposition if the project is already there. We have also seen a lot of the planned hydrogen salt caverns are being planned adjacent to existing natural gas facilities, and within this can potentially reduce the lead times during planning and permitting. And this is the theoretical framework that the IEA used. This framework is actually very much cited by the European Commission, by the US Department of Energy. And here at the very beginning, we have the different theoretical levels of the storage technologies. And we use this to really highlight the importance that the technologies that are in the red and the orange side move further, because they haven't been demonstrated at a scale yet. So that really creates a challenge if we are to use these technologies in the next 10 years, especially when we take into account the innovation cycles of other technologies that took 20 years to develop. Like, we can't afford long innovation cycles, so we really need to speed up and we need a turbocharging innovation in order to move as fast as possible those technologies from the very bottom to the top. Yes, as a conclusion, well, one thing that is clear is that the announcements in underground gas storage projects are still small, especially small compared to transmission pipelines. We see that there are much more announcements about transmission pipelines than about underground gas storage, in spite of the importance it could have for flexibility, but also for security purpose. So we think there is the need to bring up more relevance to the security discussion. We need innovation, and we want to highlight that, and innovation needs money, and demonstration projects are expensive. So there is a need to have sufficient funding in order to move in the TRL scale. We need adequate planning well in advance that takes into account in an holistic approach natural gas, hydrogen, and CO2, and how is going to be made this orderly transition from natural gas to hydrogen and CO2, and how we can best repurpose existing facilities there. And we also need certain degree of regulatory certainty, market certainty, because there will be no final investment decision if companies don't know how much money they will get out of it. So we hope in September we will publish the next Global Hydrogen Review 2023. We hope to cover this with more detail and to provide more insights about hydrogen infrastructure needs.
Thank you, Amalia. Thank you so much for providing this great insights. Unfortunately, also the International Energy Agency has not the crystal ball, but still I think you have a lot of data, and therefore thank you so much. With that, and with any further ado, I'd like to come to our next panelist. So where is it here? It's Carole le Hénaff. She's head of the EU affairs at Storengy and chairwoman of the Storage Working Group at the Hydrogen Task Force at Gas Infrastructure Europe. And in this role, I'm very happy that you will present the perspective of GIE on the future hydrogen market development, but especially on the different values hydrogen underground storage can provide for the energy system. And we are very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Do I just have to move like that?
Oh, sorry.
Please, if you don't mind. I can say a few words about GIE. Yeah, of course. Can you hear me well? Or do you like this way? Is it better this way?
For the recording, it's better.
Okay. It's not very the best way to do it, but I like the idea that you can hear me. So first of all, I want to say a few words about GIE, which is an association representing 68 members, and I'm at Storengy, so one of them, from 27 countries and gathering all the operators of gas infrastructure and hydrogen. Sorry. And so LNG terminal operator, transmission pipeline operator, and also storage operator. And today I will say a few words about hydrogen storage as part of GIE. In a nutshell, I will try to do it quite quickly because it's already the afternoon. So first of all, we have said a few words about the fact that there is some mismatch between the supply and the demand. There is even, we could say, an increasing mismatch between supply and demand patterns, because compared to underground gas storage, if we look at the supply, if we say gas storage, it was stable in the past, related to the fact that the production was stable. And now we have to understand, in terms of supply, how we can embrace the development of renewable electricity sources, meaning that we have to deal with hourly, weekly, seasonal patterns in the future. Mainly hourly, weekly, if we if we talk about the very short term. And of course, the more renewable we will have in the power mix, the more we will have to talk about seasonal patterns. And of course, if we have a change in the power system, that means also that the role of storage will change. And this is why we have to talk about the supply in itself. On the demand side, you already know a lot about the fact that we provide seasonality, but we will have also to see in the near future how we can provide a stable supply for industrial user, and to what extent we can also find a way we have to deal also with thermal-sensitive consumer in the future. So we have also a lot of things to be done on the demand side. So today it's not easy to talk about underground hydrogen storage, also because we have a lot of things written for batteries. And most business developers, what they do today, they are on this left-hand side. They oversize the race because they want to increase the load factor of the electrolyzer, so they can get something which is at a lower price in terms of cost of production. And it's fine, and they store part of this excess of renewable either via batteries or via the power system. So it's a solution compared to a solution without batteries. But if we take into consideration that we will have a rise of RES in the power mix, then we will see that these benefits will erode over time because these short-term solutions are not scalable and will increase the cost of congestion in the power system. So this is where we have to talk about the near future if we want to talk about a real increase of RES in the power mix. And it's where we have to explain that the high deployment of RES, which is required in most member countries, require actually that we require a molecule-based system. We can't store on the power system. It's not scalable, or it's the beginning, but it will not be sufficient at all. And there is no alternative than hydrogen storage. So we should be very vocal about that, because if they don't invest in these technologies, they don't have alternative, whereas they have said that they have high and ambitious target for renewable. So they should see something in addition to the high production of RES. They have to understand how it will work with the system. And if we understand that we need to rely on a molecule-based system with the support of hydrogen storage, is because we are going to talk about co-optimization of the energy system. So we are not going only to provide solution for hydrogen demand, providing cleaner hydrogen demand, delivering clean hydrogen, but we will also secure the efficiency of the whole energy system, including the electricity one, with salt carbon or even depleted field. Knowing that, we have worked this last year with ACER-CEER as part of GIE, and we have asked ACER-CEER to explain and quantify, first to explain the role of storage, and then to quantify these values in territorial use case. So we have done this work. No. Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. So we have done this work with ACER-CEER for GIE, and we have tried to quantify this value. Because in reality, if we talk about co-optimization of the energy system, if we have to explain that we provide some resilience in the system as a whole, we need to quantify it. We need to provide value. We need to provide value so later on we can talk about remuneration, always. So we have worked on that, and first of all, we have defined different values that has been explained even the first day, yesterday. So thank you for that, because it it means that people understand that something has been done. So thank you for that. And we have defined these values, and we have defined at the same time some KPIs. So we are able to quantify it. It's not only, low-based trying to explain something without quantifying anything. We have done it with some KPIs, and we have worked on different territorial use cases, because today we don't have the gas storage with all the different revenue streams. We have to start with industrial user first, and then we will see if we can also provide solution to other kind of consumer. So today I won't be able to go to explain all the different territorial use cases. It would be too long. But the idea would be to give you one example, and I hope I will be that you will understand, because it's not so easy if it's the first time that you see these charts. So on the left-hand side, there is a system without underground hydrogen storage, and on the right-hand side, you have the same result, but with hydrogen storage. And the goal was to compare the benefits and explaining that with hydrogen storage, of course, you get higher benefits because in reality, you avoid some cost in terms of CO2 emission, in terms of system cost. So there are many ways we can explain this avoided cost. If we look at the system without underground hydrogen storage, the first chart is about electricity, and the red line is the demand coming from the electrolyzer, because for the electricity system, hydrogen producers are considered as a new demand, additional demand, coming for this additional electricity based on renewable source. And here is, for example, if we are in a situation where you have to deliver clean hydrogen to the industrial user, the demand is completely flat. So we need to deliver something which is completely stable. And this is their request. So what's happening, in fact, most of the time when you rely on the grid, so in blue and green, solar and wind, and in yellow and green, solar, again, in yellow and green, yes, the solar and wind, I think that something is wrong. And in blue, it's the electricity, but coming from the grid, which can be black, coming from fossil fuel. So most of the time, if you can't rely on storage, large-scale storage, what's happening is that if the demand is not sufficient compared to the development of your dedicated race, and you have a lot of sun this day or today, and you can't store it, then you will have curtailment. If there is an excess of race compared to your demand, there will be curtailment because you can't store it. And if there is no sun or wind, you will rely on the grid based on fossil fuel, which is not very good because it's a lot of CO2 emission. Whereas if you are in a situation where you have underground hydrogen storage, in reality, you co-optimize the energy system by having already the right size of electrolyzer, which is dimensioned in relation to the rest peak. So the best day where you have a lot of sun. And in a way, if you have an excess of sun or wind, you can store it in the storage. And then, of course, when there is no sun or wind, you can withdraw it and deliver something which is greener. It was not the case without storage. Even if you have batteries, for example, you believe that you can store, but only for 3, 4, 5 hours. So most of the time you rely on the grid, which is still very black. And so you can't find a way you get the best use of and the cheapest use of RES. I don't know if I was clear, but you can call me later or even calling Artelis. I know it's not the best thing to do. What is important here is that you can see that we have been able to quantify it and deliver some very nice results for underground hydrogen storage. Of course, I won't explain all of them, don't worry, but just look at them and see that all the indicators are dynamic. What does that mean? Is that we have increasingly we have shown that for different level of capacity of storage, we have even better results, which is even better for us because, as you know, we have to develop a lot of capacity to discuss the capex later. No, it's not funny. Okay, so it's the end. Don't worry. So what do we need? Is an appropriate vision for the role of large-scale storage. What does that mean? If we talk about the value of storage, actually this value is very important, vital across all stages of the market development, and not only for the hydrogen system, but for the energy system as a whole. What does that mean? Is that, for example, today we talk a lot about insurance value, but as you know, insurance value has been delivered up to now by underground gas storage. And the question is not, is it via underground gas storage or underground hydrogen storage, but knowing that we have to convert most of our asset to be ready to deliver something other technologies won't be ready to do it. So we need to understand that we deliver values. At the beginning, it could be a kickstart value. So we explain how we can promote more renewable generation. Later on, if we are part of a backbone, or we can deliver also some system co-optimization with electricity one. And only in 2036, Benoît, we are supposed to be in a mature market, I think, where we could demonstrate that if we are ready, 2036, mature market, then suppliers can compete by having some storage where we can say that, don't worry, you can get access to it. It will be possible for all the suppliers to get access to storage. So if 2036 is the mature market, yes, we need some pilot project, yes. And then, of course, if we are able to reduce the cost of hydrogen, green hydrogen, then we can demonstrate later that we can even provide power to gas to power. It's a question of time. So all these values need to be recognized. Thank you very much.
Carole, now it's working again. Thank you so much. So, yeah, I think it's, as you said, it's important to also quantify these values and to give an idea of how hydrogen underground storage really can contribute to the grid and to the whole energy system. And one thing you have already mentioned is the European hydrogen backbone. And I'm very pleased that Martijn Overgaag is with us, the director of Guidehouse, and with more than 2 decades experience in the energy and chemical business. And today he is presenting the European Hydrogen Backbone Initiative, as well as Gas for Climate. We are happy that you're here and bringing in the transmission system operators perspective, the infrastructure perspective, and of course, we've seen storage doesn't go without any infrastructure, and probably also the other way around. Thank you for being here.
Yep. Thanks, Christophe. Yeah, so indeed, we're talking about system value. It's a very big challenge, because if we saw today all the different uncertainties that exist, we're talking about new technologies that are not demonstrated, and what I think is needed from a full system perspective is to make comparisons, integrating all energy technologies. And the difficulty is that depending on which technology is playing a role in that total system, some technologies are proven, have very reliable data to them, and others have just much more unreliable data and forecasts based on what people extrapolate today. So that is very complicated. So when we're modeling, so I also don't have a crystal ball. That's something to take into account. We can model anything, but I think there's quite a few fundamental values, as Carole explained them. And so qualitatively, I think we all understand them, and we can also all make them quite understandable to a broad public. But once you go into detail and model the world, need to be very cautious in what you do and why and how to communicate. There are many data out there. Specifically, I'm introducing the European Hydrogen Backbone Initiative, which is a collaboration of natural gas TSOs of Europe. 31 involved in the collaboration since 3 years. We've started 3 years ago by bringing this group together as Guidehouse. Guidehouse is a consultancy, my employer. So basically we brought parties together to develop a joint mission, which is around the role of hydrogen, and specifically since all those members currently are asset owners of natural gas pipelines, how could these existing assets play a role in a future zero carbon energy system? That is the mission that this initiative is working on, and to highlight these values, to engage with external stakeholders. The specific audience is then Brussels, the Commission, Council, Parliament, to bring ideas, to bring suggestions on how to build policies, build regulations. That's basically the scope of this collaboration. And within this collaboration, we conduct studies to identify costs. What are these costs to repurpose pipelines? To bring those numbers out. And we were the first ones 3 years ago to bring up hydrogen transmission costs. And over time, there are more studies, and there's also more facts out there. But you need to also be very, very careful when looking at those data. What is the background of this data in this nascent market? If you have a price point that comes from a steel producer who puts in a quote to a project that is critical and they want to win because it's a first-of-kind hydrogen pipeline project, it can be a very low price point. It can be a very unprofitable price that this vendor is deliberately quoting. And if you're then going to pick that number and extrapolate it to the rest of Europe, then you reach, of course, different conclusions. The difficulty that we see is that there are many modeling studies out there, and there's a lot of recycling of data. And in the end, these end results are so important in having policymakers decide for the regulation that we all want. That's a side note before I introduce what we have been doing. So this is this mission, what I already explained. So there is existing infrastructure that can play a role. We demonstrate that cost-wise, it's a smart thing to do. But next to cost, there are other values, as Carole already said. I think there are some other fundamental values that are related to environment and, for example, in some parts of Europe, also nitrogen deposition. Building anything new in terms of infrastructure will increasingly over the next decades be difficult in Europe. We talk about permitting and speed of permitting, but just in general, fundamentally, build new assets under the ground. It will become more difficult over time because of environmental issues. The end goal is of this initiative to create a collaboration across Europe, to create an integrated European network. So it's not just about having infrastructure of any kind. No, it's about a connected infrastructure. And to create the certainty to market actors, supply and demand, that when they choose a location for hydrogen production, that they can rely on the availability of a certain network that can transport their volumes to demand centers. If you don't have that certainty, as a project developer, then you will locate your asset elsewhere at maybe a suboptimal location in Europe, where your renewable power generation conditions are just less favorable. If the certainty is given by policymakers that this infrastructure will develop, it will lead to many efficiency gains across the whole system. And these are the things that this collaboration is trying to highlight. From the start, we have been maintaining maps. These are the current maps that are to be found on the website of the initiative. And these maps, important to note that these are not planning maps. These are visionary maps. So these are the visions of all the members in terms of what their long-term ideas are about deploying hydrogen pipeline infrastructure in their countries, which is completely different from, for example, what we saw this morning in the study that Christophe presented. That's a modeling result. So what we show here is an ambition, which has another, say, information value into the system. So overall, what we see in these maps is there's 53,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipeline infrastructure going to be needed in the system. And there's a lot of repurposing. 60% of these pipelines and these ambitions of the members consist of repurposed natural gas pipelines. This number dates from last year. We are currently working on an update of these numbers, and we expect that the 60% will change. The 60% has changed since the start of the initiative, and essentially it has dropped. The explanation of that is that over the last 3 years, the amount of members to the collaboration has increased, and more countries that currently don't have any existing natural gas pipeline infrastructure has joined the initiative. So with those members joining, there are more new pipelines introduced in the system. So relatively, the amount of repurposed pipelines in our communication has dropped slightly over time, but it's because of that effect that regions where natural gas is non-existent today are joining. Because of the war, of course, last year, all of our members have had to reconsider their plans, and also the speed of the transition towards repurposing towards hydrogen, because many natural gas pipelines that were first anticipated to become available quite soon for transition, there's a new reality. Some of those pipelines need to suddenly transport natural gas in a different direction. So because of this, these numbers will change. We will update a paper next month, so end of next month, so not next week. That will provide new statements around these percentages. Last year we worked on the various supply corridors that can develop. This is quite consistent with what is also communicated in the 10E communications by the Commission. Basically, what we show here is in order to connect the supply centers within Europe, domestic supply, with demand centers, which is mainly Greater Germany. That's where by 2030 the biggest amount of demand will exist. You need corridors to bring things together. A corridor is not an individual development project. No, a corridor will consist of different stretches of pipeline that are connected. You need interconnections across countries, and you need project developers to step in and to basically build the stretches that all in the end become this kind of corridor. So corridor is more a bit of a communication term than it is a project. However, what we see in the last year within our membership is that all of the gas TSOs have really taken up a leadership role and have created projects very quickly. Many of them have advanced very, very fast in terms of moving ahead pre-feasibility, feasibility studies, And some projects are already FID in this development. Many of those projects are cross-boundary, so it's collaborations between TSOs on different sides of a border, and also include other third parties that have a role to play in the system. Next to this, the majority of these projects have also applied for PCI funding, Project of Common Interest. It's a process that the European Commission launched last year. If your project is qualified or shortlisted by the Commission as a project that has a common European interest, hence the name, it will give the project developer benefits in terms of the state in which you operate will then prioritize procedures, prioritize permitting for your project. So that's an important process to go through. That's happening this year. Just to illustrate the significance of this in a market, more than 150 pipeline infrastructure projects have been submitted. And that's more than in any other PCI category. So that just shows the leadership that developers are taking. And many of those initiatives are really very much inspired by the Repower EU communications of the Commission last year. So that's EHB, consisting of, say, mostly all gas TSOs across Europe. EHB as an initiative originated from what is shown here, the Gas for Climate collaboration, which is a collaboration that exists already for longer, for 8 years now. The parties mentioned on this slide, they are participants to a modeling study that we launched earlier this year under this Gas for Climate brand. Gas for Climate started, say, 8 years ago already to highlight the role of the existing gas TSOs and gas infrastructure for renewable gas as a whole. So not only synthetic gas as hydrogen, but also the role for biomethane in the system. And well, not all of these, but the selection of those parties came then together 8 years ago because they saw that especially the European policy debate was really about electrification only. The whole debate was about moving to zero carbon, and we're going to fully electrify Europe, which of course is a solution. But the clear commercial interest by these companies is that their assets would lose their value. So clear, it's a commercial interest, but it's also, you know, these assets are there. These are existing assets. They might play a role. So that's why these parties came together and have been working for longer on this dialogue. Coming back to the crystal balls, this study is also a crystal ball, just to be fully honest. So what we did in this study is look into the question of whether this interconnection is indeed a smart thing to do when looking at hydrogen. So what we tried to compare is a future, say, endpoint of the transition in Europe. So reaching zero carbon by 2050, comparing, allowing cross-border hydrogen infrastructure to develop, or the situation in which you do still reach that zero carbon future, but you do so without creating interconnections across countries for hydrogen. Well, what does this mean? So if you don't allow cross-border transmission of hydrogen, you will still develop hydrogen in the system, but it will remain local. It will remain clusters around the larger demand centers. Without a large connected infrastructure, you of course also create a different market. There's a different liquidity in the market if you don't have the possibility to ship across Europe. So that's the comparison that's made in this modeling study. So it starts off from this EHB picture. Again, that picture is still the mission, so that's not the modeling result. What we show here is the modeling result. So what we modeled is across all energy vectors, so power, natural gas, which has biomethane included in the mix, and hydrogen, all modeled towards this desired endpoint. And what we did in this modeling is we characterized all the energy production, storage, import technologies, and then ran the optimization to show what is the difference in terms of total societal cost, or total system cost, between these two worlds. And the conclusion is that there's a 330 billion cost savings over the period towards 2050 if you allow these interconnections to be invested in. What we also did here is include storage, of course. While the focus of this study was really the pipeline infrastructure, we did not model the storage in an as detailed way as Christoph demonstrated this morning. What we did do, however, is we started off from the Repower EU goals. So the volumes that we have here are significantly higher. It's not that we used those numbers as an input. We used the supply and demand surveys that we did last year with market actors in terms of coming to the demand figures. And that these demand figures are then specifically for say, the industrial hydrogen demand volumes. The role in the power system is really modeled by the system. So that's all optimized. Based on this lowest cost, this cost minimization job that the model did. So this is what we see here then as a result. And I think if you have time, we don't go into details of these exact numbers, because of course they are all different across the different studies, because they have different backgrounds and starting points. There are a few copies of the study outside the door, and that's a summary, but online we try to be fully transparent in terms of what we assumed and what not. But essentially this shows the seasonal impact that the storage will have. Before closing, this is overall the outcome of this modeling. So this modeling study shows 90 terawatt hours storage capacity need for Europe by 2030. And this grows towards 500 terawatt hours, reaching net zero carbon by the end of by 2050, basically. I think more or less, so these are the main recommendations that the EHB initiative sees. So again, this is focused on pipeline infrastructure operators. In order to accelerate the market, it's important that everything that's in the way to make these investment decisions. We're talking about standards. We're talking about the PCI list. We're talking about the governance and the importance of planning. That these things become clear very quickly. And of course, the gas package decision by the end of the year is important. But that's not the only thing. There are more things that need to be realized. And in 2 weeks from now, there's the Copenhagen Infrastructure Forum convention, where also the Commission agenda will be reaffirmed for the rest of the year. So as we see it, priorities for repurposing existing infrastructure and providing the certainties for operators to develop their project further is important. One point to close off with regarding storage. As I see it, storage has a very big role to play. Indeed, when I saw the slide with the various values that Carole presented, yes, there's this whole system value to look at. For me, that's a concern, because it's extremely difficult to quantify, to model this full system value. There are many dependencies. So for policymakers to do that, very complicated to actually have this complete system value calculated. But let's assume that the right decisions are made to pave the way, specifically to storage. As I see it, the location where you're going to need to develop this storage, we can nicely say 500 terawatt hours. But where you would need the storage, say 10 years from now, yeah, you need to know which other infrastructures developments are going to happen. So if you can't rely on this pipeline network to be deployed, or otherwise, if you know that the pipeline infrastructure will not be deployed, yeah, you would need these storages in a very different location. So these complications, they just add up, and for me this just confirms the need to have a very rapid decision by the Commission on how this infrastructure planning exercise across all the energy vectors is going to be realized. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, especially this last point, quite interesting and quite important. So bringing the infrastructure as an important puzzle piece into the whole picture. But now, last but not least, Benoît, Esnault, I'm happy that you're here representing, let's say, the fourth perspective, which we had not had so far today. So the regulator's perspective. Benoît has also more than 20 years experience in energy regulation. You joined National Regulatory Authority of France, CRE, in 2008 and are currently head of interconnections and European Affairs Department. Today you also represent the perspective of ACER, the Energy of Cooperation of the Energy Regulators in Europe, and the Council of European Regulators. We are very happy to have you here, and yeah, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here as well. Thank you for inviting me. I always like to bring the regulator's voice. Today was a kind of a surprise to me. I didn't hear a lot about expectations from regulators' decisions, because often what I hear from the industry is now it's the role of regulators to make things happen. My answer is no, we cannot make things happen. We cannot be responsible for inviting something which does not exist. The role of regulators of a different nature, and I will be back to this in this presentation, just to give you a kind of flavor of the institutional challenges we have in front of us, because the very nature of this green hydrogen sector is that it doesn't exist. So, well, it's, let's say, there are lots of forecasts, scenarios, things are foreseen, and the role of regulators is just to be a kind of part of a toolbox, an institutional toolbox, which is there to help policymakers to make things happen. But we just play on the rules of the game, and sometimes we agree on some investments, but we have no money, we cannot bring subsidies, it's not our task. Our task is to think about the design of the system and help, let's say, the operators to have a reflection on something which is workable in the long term. To me, it's very important, because beyond the expectations, expectations in terms of developments, but also about the technological improvements. It's a large part of the debate on hydrogen. And then here, our role is at some point to make decisions. And if a TSO comes to us and say, I would like to repurpose a gas pipeline, what are we supposed to say? What would be the, let's say, the economical conditions? What would be the split of risks? And to what extent do we engage the French consumers, from my perspective, to pay in the future for these assets, whether they would need or not? Because the status of regulated infrastructure is that, at least for what exists in gas and electricity, they are secured in terms of costs. So you see the kind of responsibility we have on our shoulders. So that's why I really enjoy this kind of study. And I mean, a GIE study was very interesting, because precisely what we need is now to think about business models. I heard that during the presentation about this Hystories project, you were still looking at business cases. And that's true, we need to have business cases. So pilot projects, of course, as absolutely necessary. including the consumers, because to me, often what is missing here, we're talking about figures, is consumers. And I'll be back to that in my speech. Just a few elements about the context in which we are. We all know there are lots of expectations about hydrogen, but let me just introduce one point, which I think is important, is that if we move towards, let's say, green energies, renewables, we're getting to a world of scarcity. So that's, to me, critical, which means that hydrogen has to find a place amongst other sectors, and especially this green electricity will have to be split between electricity usages and hydrogen generation. That's, to me, a clear issue, and the ambitions that we have in REPowerEU just mean that we will need 500 terawatt-hours of green electricity in 2030, just dedicated to hydrogen production, which means more than the current consumption of France. I mean, in terms of electricity, which is one of the biggest electricity consumers in Europe. So it's very important to have this in mind. So what can I say about the context? And you will see that we regulators, even though we still do not have any legal obligation or responsibility, are part of the reflection and part of the game. First, the 2020 strategy of the European Commission. To me, it was a very good starting point. Ambitions, true, but with a reflection about the development of the chain of this sector, starting from, let's say, local developments, hydrogen values, and then thinking about infrastructure to connect these elements. And what was interesting, and I did not hear a lot, but I just arrived this afternoon about this, is this sector coupling reflection about the articulation between electricity and hydrogen. And the GIE study, one of its great merits is precisely to have looked at the value of storage from the perspective of a sector coupling organization orientation. Seeing what is the added value of storage for storing energy in general, including, this relationship between intermittent power generation and flat H2 demand. Then we moved to the legislative proposal of the Commission. Carole mentioned the regulation of storage now by 2036. I mean, there are lots of discussions nowadays amongst the Parliament, between the Parliament and the Council, but we've been debating these proposals for quite a while now, for almost a year and a half, and we're getting into the trilogue process, and hopefully we'll have a package at the end of the year. The main points regarding hydrogen was this inspiration from natural gas. And I'll be back to that afterwards, but I think it's far from being neutral. Gas TSOs were part of the reflection, and the hydrogen backbone clearly shows that, with a vision, but a vision from, let's say, an infrastructure perspective. When we're in the seat of a regulator, we need to have the global perspective, meaning that it's good to have infrastructure, but the very reflection we have is, what is the role of infrastructure? Should they come first as a facilitator, as an enabler, or should we have first a reflection on where we are going to produce and consume hydrogen and see what is the potential need for hydrogen transmission? And to me, the PCI process, which was mentioned just before, bypasses this kind of debate, bringing to, let's say, ENSOG and the future ENSO for hydrogen, the role to determine how to calculate the value of this infrastructure. But we get from these projects of common interest from the beginning, and believe me, we still do not have a clear cost and benefit analysis for these kinds of projects. So we have to decide on a list by the end of the year, but it will be more, let's say, an indication of what is what could happen and what is the level of reflection of project promoters. Then we have this REPowerEU. So you see, we need a lot where there are expectations from regulators, and REPowerEU with this big ambition by 2030, which is tomorrow, as you all know, being aware of the industrial constraints. So then, what are these challenges for this nascent system, which is the hydrogen, the green hydrogen sector? It's clearly creating the conditions to have the development of a new sector, but with a lot of challenges, I would say. I will not be back to this question of the availability of electricity, but to me, and it's something that I often discuss, particularly with industrial consumers, which is the competitiveness of green hydrogen. Nowadays, what I heard is the issue is that many consumers are interested in getting involved in some projects, but they're not able to sign on a future contract because nowadays it's too expensive and they are competing with, let's say, gray hydrogen. They are competing with other regions. So our collective challenge is to bring the costs at the minimum level. I heard in a recent conference that we had to divide all the costs by 2 to get the competitiveness of green hydrogen. I don't know to what level it was relevant, this figure, but I mean, this is what was discussed. So here I'm not an expert of hydrogen itself, I'm just bringing what I hear from the industry. So when we discuss, and also with the European Commission, I remember last year at the Copenhagen Forum, you may not be aware of the overall, this big machinery of regulation in Europe, but we have different fora, and including the Copenhagen Forum, which focuses on energy infrastructure. So it is held in every June, and here the conclusion from the Commission was to say, we electrify first, and then we get to the molecules. I think it was an important message to still have in mind. So I mean here, that means that nowadays, the reflection, the maturity of the reflection is to say we're first focusing on heavy industry, where it's hard to decarbonize, in the sectors where HU is already consumed, and amongst the other outlets for hydrogen, we see heavy transport. But this reflection about the thermal use of hydrogen, to me, is more leading to a conclusion that in the household sector for heating, probably hydrogen will not be the solution, and probably one would prefer electricity, biogas, combined solutions, and so on. And it's very important to have this global picture here to identify the need for infrastructure, for HU infrastructure. Other aspects, and I mean, I think it's been described today, is that if we move towards, let's say, large-scale consumption of hydrogen, for sure, the new issues will occur, which are, and here you can get a lot of inspiration from the gas sector, including quality of service, the quality of hydrogen. Lots of debates. In Germany, I think that the basic standard is 98% of purity, but for high level, let's say, sophisticated usages, we need to reach a 99.7, something like that, 0.5 purity of hydrogen, which means that it's highly constraining. And that means that on the infrastructure level, we must be sure that what gets out from the infrastructure is proper for being consumed by the final consumers. Another aspect is security of supply, and that means that we will need some redundancies, and clearly the role of storage will be critical to avoid potentially some duplication of electrolyzers. But here, what does it mean in terms of territory? I think it's important to acknowledge from the beginning that storages are located where the proper geological structures are, which means that, and if I looked at the French mapping of hydrogen development, we have somewhere kind of different strategies. If I take the Dunkirk region, the Seine Valley, or the southeast of France, in the southeast of France, we have in Manosque some storages where clearly it is an enabler to develop a kind of hydrogen chain at a local level with big industrial consumers, refineries, and here there is a big potential with the storage. In other regions, we need to think a little bit differently because we do not have the same kind of structure. That means that brings the reflection about long distance pipelines, but here we will need to have a proper development, a joint development, I would say, of all the elements of the value chain. So in terms of infrastructure, what we see is that there is a lot of pressure, it's not a negative word here, from gas infrastructure managers and operators, in particular in the pipeline sector. Now it's important to see how things are going to develop, and it's very important that pipeline operators are also advising in a proper way their customers and have a view to the business. We can all say that not everything will be funded by public money. We will need to have contracts. We will need to have consumers paying for that. And in the long term, the hydrogen sector should be self-sufficient, economically speaking. In any case, in terms of regulation, nowadays I would say it's a little bit too early if we look at the concept of regulation as it exists now. But it's clear that if we have big infrastructure with third-party access principles, the concept of essential facility, clearly regulation will make sense. Then, what about infrastructure regulation? First, it's important to remind, I think, that our collective vision of regulation comes from gas and electricity. I mean, I have exactly the same kind of reactions looking at regulation as many operators, but gas and electricity, when we introduce the regulation as it works with third-party access and the concept of regulated asset bases, these sectors were expanding, big sectors, low costs, and a lot of needs on consumer side, which means here that developing a new element of infrastructure was and is still quite easy because you have a big market to then cover the cost. Making a mistake is not a big issue because you have a lot of consumers to which you can pass the costs. In hydrogen, for sure, the situation is completely different. The very question is, if we build a new pipe, is it going to be used? It's clear that we need to take some risks. I mean, otherwise nothing will happen. So this chicken and egg issue, which was shown before, is there. So it's important to go ahead and to decide on some things. But on the other side, it's important also to have in mind the fact that if demand is not there in the end, because I mean, big industries prefer getting to Canada or Asia, then the risk is that we will have developed all this with a very low use, and that could be very costly for the society. I know it's very challenging, not saying if we shouldn't go ahead, but it's important to have this in mind. Then, concluding about hydrogen storage, here I would say that the reflection of regulators is not very advanced, neither on H2 pipelines, because it's something really new, and we really expect from the industry and the studies and so on to give some elements to improve our understanding and our creativity. But it's clear that storage, and it's been well showed today, storage has proved really to be critical in the gas sector. We can get a lot of lessons from natural gas, but we also need to be aware that the conditions for use of storage for hydrogen will be different, always having in mind the electrolysis sector and the fact that you can also get some flexibility from electrolysis, which is not the case which is less the case for natural gas, where we have this rigidity from the massive imports to supply the European market. So here, just my final word will be that regulation actually will get inspiration from the needs of the market. Actually, what will be developed in terms of rules of use must be based on the needs. And that's why the dialogue with industry is absolutely fundamental. Nowadays, it's a little bit early to design regulation, but I do not doubt that in the very future, we will together be creative on this topic. Thank you very much. I hope I've not been too long. sitting there.
Thank you so much, Benoît. And yeah, I may welcome all of the four panelists now to the stage. I think it was great to hear the four different perspectives. In the end, we learned that the future regulation market environmental is maybe strongly inspired by natural gas, but of course there are quite a lot of differences between natural gas and hydrogen. Due to the time, and I think maybe we give the word to the audience first to see whether there are some questions to some of the panelists. So feel free if there are any. Yeah, we have one over there.
Hello, could you maybe help me?
Thank you so much. Hippolyte Dizan from INERIS. Could you please go back to the presentation of Dr. Amalia Pizarro? I have a short question on slide 8 of this presentation.
Very specific question. So it's about the TRL.
Yes, it's about this, yes. I would like to say from what have been said these Tuesdays in this room, could it be possible to change the classification of aquifer or depleted gas on this, moving, for example, from a small prototype to at least large prototype? This question is addressed to Amalia and to Dr. Arnaud.
So this is, if you have suggestion, actually, we will publish an updated version on the 3rd of July. So I can just give me, or if you share with me your email, I will be happy, because actually we are in the process with the hydrogen TCP to update this. So any suggestion is welcome, and I also say this to everyone. We are publishing an updated version in the next month. So please, we welcome your suggestions from the experts.
And yes, if the question was also to me, I also heard with some colleagues some comments about that, and I think it's not really the vision of Hystories. Maybe it's not also really the conclusion of the IEA TCP work, and that CEER just co-coordinated. So maybe there are some updates to this graph we can make, yes.
Thank you.
I have another question to Martin. Could you please go back to his presentation, to slide 8, please?
Very specific.
Moment here. Here we have it. Yep.
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank you for this graphic, because it had a great success on LinkedIn when you publish this graphic. I have a short question on the dot line related to the import-export pipeline and subsea pipeline. Could you tell more about it? What is the difference? What is the import,
is your question
export?
why they are dotted?
Yes.
Because there are subsea pipelines.
And import-export. What is the link between both?
Not sure what you're referring. Oh, they're on the top. Yeah. So the red. You mean the red legend on the top? So basically, these are connections. So for example, here coming from the east and from Africa. So there's the European territory. There's the European Union, which we talk from the perspective of Europe. Was imported into Europe. That's
I understand.
the logic.
So the dot line from import-export is hydrogen coming from outside and going from outside the European Union, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Yes, but just to be specific, this map just shows infrastructure. It does not show the direction of flow.
Totally.
And so that there is a pipeline, but which direction the flow will be is not something that this map shows.
Thank you. Kerry Vincent from CO2GNet. I have a question for all the panel. And I wanted to know, how do we make sure that we don't import carbon with our hydrogen, since half of the hydrogen is to be imported in the future vision? Thank you.
Who wants to start?
I don't have the answer. Honestly, that's a good question.
I know it's written in the delegated act that we should apply the same rules for those who are within Europe and those who are outside of Europe, but they haven't been able up to now to explain exactly how they will proceed. So I imagine that it will be the next step.
I can just say that the IEA, I think it was on April, working within the framework of the G7 and Japan, we have published a report on towards, it's not a definition of low emission hydrogen, but some kind of common rules or standards. We suggest to use the methodology of the IPCEI about how to estimate emissions, but we haven't still defined what is low emission hydrogen because it is a very controversial topic. But we will provide more insights on September. So I can't say it now, but it's a topic we are working on how to ensure we are importing low emission hydrogen.
Yeah, so the RFMBO rules is indeed sets the standard, and there's a lot of debate before those rules are set in place. So that's at least to secure that we don't import CO2, but on top of it, indeed define how to calculate this, and then I think the most complicated thing is how to check whether the country of origin applies those rules, those same rules, and how to in the end audit that. These are, I think, significant challenges to be taken care of, but that should be the way.
Thank you. So there's one, let's say, final question.
Yes, thank you. We have seen that we really need to speed up development much faster than we did maybe for gas storages in the past. Was also with the figure from IEA. We also see that there's long lead times. That's a challenge. How do you see these challenges in respect to repurposing natural gas storages that are already existing versus developing new sites, new caverns, etc.? I would like to hear some of your opinions on that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, for example, in GIE, the next study we will launch is about defining some targets, because up to now there are some targets for, at least for Repower EU ambition in terms of production, but nothing for infrastructure. Even if we have already some development on the topic, it's not targets. And we would like to have these targets because even if we don't have a regulation before 2036, we need some stimulation, and we need member states to get the right incentive to understand that this amount of capacity need to be built or developed or converted before we achieve, for example, 2030, 2040, and 2050. So the idea is to show the gap, missing gap, so the gap between the announced project and what should be achieved if we comply with the Repower EU ambition. And the story behind chicken and an egg, we still believe in GIE. And this is why we are we really like the idea that we can work with Guidehouse, Artelis, is that we can demonstrate that we need first a network, because we are network industries, and it's not chicken and an egg, because we need first a network, and then later on to start discussing competition between suppliers, because first they need to get access to where we can match supply and demand. So if it's not regulation, we need some incentive, which means we need targets, and we are going to define them. And then, for example, in Germany, it has not been done in France, for example, but in Germany, the INES association have said we need this target by 2030, you see the missing gap. You know what we can't convert all the storage because there are some reasons behind the security of supply aspect. So we'll have to start at an earlier stage, even new build storage sites. So they even start discussing new build storage site wherever they haven't started so much working on converted part. So I think if we have this target, that will help a lot to discuss what should we do. And even if you will tell me that it's 10 years lead time we need for new build storage, it can make sense, as we know that we use our own storage site for security of supply now, and that most of them are not available. So we need both. And sensitive analysis on the topic will help a lot to see how we can fill this gap.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that. I agree with Carole around the role of putting out a target, and it's indeed difficult. What should that target be? But at least it's so much needed, because otherwise there are so many different policies out there in which the different values that we talked about earlier are organized. So we talk about different functions that storage plays, and if you want to regulate that all across all the different instruments, it's just an endless debate. And I think Benoît also explained clearly that the regulator has a certain role to play, and it can't be played fully by regulators, in my view. And on top of the various functions that were already presented, I was also thinking about, say, the full year supply of crude oil that is stocked in the port of Rotterdam as a strategic reserve. Well, that's a crude oil fossil reserve now for the system. Over time, that should also be a different type of commodity that we use for that across Europe. So that's then also another function that these storages will play, and a lot of debate is still then needed. Which carrier should it then be in the future? I'm not saying that should be this hydrogen in the underground, but all those different functions together, it's a very complicated mix. So in order to get things going, I think people are convinced in general, let's put out a target.
Maybe as a complement, I would say regulation is being designed already with these debates at an EU level. So to me, the question is more about the inputs from the users. And for example, according to the different consumers, the need for flexibility for different kinds of services might be different. We tend then, when thinking about this, and once more, we have no legal role nowadays as regulators within the development of the sector. The only thing we look at is potentially the repurposing of existing regulated pipelines. That's the point. And CRE has just published a study on the future of gas infrastructure, and in, let's say, the best estimate, based, I would say, no more than 5% of the existing gas pipelines could be repurposed because of the remaining needs of the gas sector. Because we're still consuming gas, and we'll be consuming gas for a while still. Then, so in this general approach, I mentioned the different challenges. I don't want to draw a pessimistic picture, but I think it's important to be aware of that. What is important is really that we have, let's say, an integrated picture of the chain. We are clear on the needs of consumers. Where will the electrolyzers be located? Because this question of the trade-off between transportation of energy under electric form or gaseous form, it's clearly a topic to address. And it's a debate in France between RTE and the gas TSOs. If I look at the North Sea, I'm not talking about repurposing of storage, but the North Sea is a very interesting example, because with the large-scale development of offshore wind, probably here we have a business case for a joint development of green power and hydrogen to reduce the bottlenecks on the electricity grid. Here, clearly, and if we have large consumers of hydrogen on the coast, then clearly that makes sense. In other regions far away from the regions where there is a lot of wind or potential solar generation, maybe the ambitions for hydrogen could be reduced. And it's important to have this reflection about not necessarily having the same kind of strategy amongst all the European countries. So, many topics, and but it's very interesting. I'm saying.
Topics, very interesting, and unfortunately, I think we do not have the time to really dig into it. One last comment, Martijn. Yes, thank you.
Because I think this repurposing is important, because I know the study that you indicated, and I showed 60% and 5%, and it's a very, very big range. So in view of this, as I see it, along the transition, building projects is already complicated enough. So I think the first 10 years, organization-wise, and it's also risk management-wise, for many projects, it might be more logical to build something new than also have the challenges of say, first repurposing. So that percentage will in the first years probably be more to the direction that Benoît indicates. The point on this 5%, because of the residual need for natural gas, for me, this is just highlighting the need for full system optimization across Europe. Because yes, we will also have biomethane in the system. In the end, we will go without natural gas, but we will still have, say, methane pipelines needed. But then if we plan and organize well, we should organize that certain regions and certain stretches of pipeline will serve that remaining need. And other parts of Europe will go fully to hydrogen, because in that way we can maximize really the use of existing infrastructure.
Thank you for this last comment. I think we will now thank the whole panel. We're really 4 very interesting presentations. Bring the whole picture here to the stage, and